The seismic sensors detected unusual vibrations beneath the border region near San Luis, Arizona, in late September. The United States Geological Survey monitored ground movement along the border as part of routine earthquake detection systems. Most readings represented natural geological activity, but a technician noticed a pattern that didn't match typical seismic signatures. The vibrations occurred at regular intervals during specific hours. They registered at shallow depths, less than 40 feet below the surface. The frequency suggested mechanical activity rather than natural ground movement. The pattern was consistent with heavy machinery operating underground in a confined space. The data was forwarded to Border Patrol because unusual underground activity near the border often indicated tunnel construction. Drug trafficking organizations had been building sophisticated tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border for over 2 decades. The tunnels represented major infrastructure investments costing millions of dollars to construct, but capable of moving tons of drugs with minimal interdiction risk. CBP tunnel detection specialists reviewed the seismic data and identified 3 separate locations showing similar patterns. The sites were spaced approximately 8 miles apart along a 30-mile stretch of border between San Luis, Arizona, and Calexico, California. The spacing suggested coordinated construction of multiple tunnels rather than a single isolated project. Ground-penetrating radar surveys confirmed the presence of voids beneath the surface at depths ranging from 30 to 50 feet. The voids showed structural characteristics consistent with excavated tunnels rather than natural cave formations. The dimensions indicated passages large enough for people to walk through while transporting cargo. DEA was brought into the investigation because tunnel operations typically represented major trafficking infrastructure used by well-funded organizations. The construction costs and technical requirements meant tunnels were built by cartels with substantial resources and long-term operational planning. Identifying and destroying tunnels could disrupt significant trafficking capacity. Surveillance operations began in October. The challenge was identifying tunnel exit points on the U.S. side of the border without alerting the operators to the investigation. The tunnels originated in Mexico, where U.S. law enforcement had no direct jurisdiction, but they terminated in buildings or properties on the American side where CBP and DEA could operate. Investigators analyzed property ownership records for buildings near the suspected tunnel locations. They identified warehouses, commercial buildings, and residential properties that could potentially conceal tunnel exits. The properties were monitored using long-range surveillance to observe activity patterns without being detected. At one location near San Luis, agents observed unusual nighttime activity at a warehouse that ostensibly stored agricultural equipment. Trucks would arrive after midnight, remain at the facility for several hours, then depart before dawn. The vehicles were registered to legitimate transportation companies, but the timing suggested operations that weren't considered commercial activity. Similar patterns emerged at the other suspected locations. A residential property in a quiet neighborhood showed vehicle traffic inconsistent with normal household activity. A small manufacturing facility reported minimal business activity during the day, but showed signs of significant nighttime operations. The pattern suggested the buildings were being used for purposes other than their apparent function. The investigation expanded when financial analysts examined utility records for the properties under surveillance. Electricity consumption at several locations significantly exceeded what their documented business activities would require. A warehouse that claimed to provide climate-controlled storage for agricultural products was using power levels consistent with running heavy industrial equipment around the clock. Water usage patterns also raised flags. Several properties showed consumption levels that didn't match their stated purposes. Tunnel construction required substantial amounts of water for controlling dust, stabilizing excavations, and operating machinery. The utility data suggested underground operations that weren't reflected in the building's apparent activities. DEA coordinated with Mexican authorities to investigate the tunnel origins on their side of the border. Mexican federal police identified properties in Mexicali and San Luis Rio, Colorado, that aligned with the tunnel trajectories detected by ground-penetrating radar. These Mexican properties showed similar characteristics to those on the U.S. Side, warehouses and commercial buildings with unusual activity patterns and high utility consumption. The tunnels represented sophisticated engineering projects. Construction required specialized knowledge of soil mechanics, structural support, and ventilation systems. The organizations building them employed professional engineers and experienced miners to design and excavate the passages. Some tunnels included electric lighting, ventilation systems, and rail tracks for moving cargo efficiently. Intelligence indicated that the tunnel network was operated by the Sinaloa Cartel, which had pioneered sophisticated tunnel construction along the California-Arizona border. The organization viewed tunnels as critical infrastructure worth the substantial investment because they provided reliable smuggling routes immune to above-ground enforcement efforts. The construction process typically took 6 to 12 months per tunnel. Crews worked around the clock, excavating from both sides of the border to meet in the middle. The work was dangerous, with risks of collapse, flooding, and oxygen depletion in the confined underground spaces. But the potential profits justified the risks and costs. Evidence suggested the tunnel network had been operational for at least 18 months before detection. During that period, the passages had moved an estimated 40 tons of cocaine and 15 tons of fentanyl into the United States. The street value of the drugs transported through the tunnels exceeded $2 billion. The operational security surrounding the tunnels was extensive. The buildings concealing tunnel exits appeared to operate legitimate businesses, providing cover for the trafficking activity. Employees at these facilities were compartmentalized, with most having no knowledge of the tunnels. Only trusted operatives were allowed access to the underground passages. Movement through the tunnels occurred during specific hours when surface surveillance was less likely. Drug loads were prepared in Mexico, moved through the tunnels during nighttime hours, and transferred to trucks on the U.S. side before dawn. The timing minimized exposure to detection while maximizing throughput. The tunnels themselves varied in sophistication. The most advanced passage included reinforced concrete walls, electric lighting powered by generators, and a rail system using small carts to transport cargo. This tunnel extended over half a mile, connecting a warehouse in Mexico with a commercial building in Calexico. The construction had cost an estimated $4 million. Other tunnels were less elaborate but still functional. They had dirt walls supported by wooden beams, basic ventilation provided by PVC pipes, and required cargo to be carried manually or dragged through on sleds. These passages cost less to build but required more labor to operate and carried higher risks of structural failure. The investigation team developed a plan to neutralize all tunnels simultaneously. If enforcement action occurred at one location while others remained operational, the cartel would abandon the exposed tunnel and increase use of the remaining passages. Coordinated operations were needed to eliminate the entire network at once. Federal prosecutors obtained warrants for the properties suspected of concealing tunnel exits. The warrants authorized searches of the buildings and excavation to expose the underground passages. Planning the operations required coordination between DEA, CBP, FBI, ICE, and local law enforcement agencies in California and Arizona. The timing was critical. The operations needed to occur when tunnels were likely to be in use, maximizing arrests and drug seizures. Intelligence indicated that major shipments moved through the network on specific days each week, when enforcement resources at above-ground crossing points were focused on other priorities. The coordinated raids occurred on a Wednesday evening in January. Federal agents executed search warrants at 8 locations simultaneously, 4 in California and 4 in Arizona. At each site, teams secured the surface buildings before beginning excavation to expose the tunnel exits. At the San Luis warehouse, agents found a concrete floor section that appeared normal, but was actually a removable panel. Beneath it, stairs descended 40 feet to a tunnel entrance. The passage extended south toward Mexico, its walls lined with plywood and supported by steel beams. Electric cables provided lighting and powered ventilation fans that circulated air through the confined space. Inside the tunnel, agents discovered 4 individuals in the process of moving drug packages from Mexico toward the U.S. Exit point. The men were arrested along with approximately 1,200 pounds of cocaine and 300 pounds of fentanyl they were transporting. The drugs were packaged in waterproof bundles designed to protect them from the damp underground environment. Similar discoveries occurred at the other locations. Each tunnel was operational at the time of the raids, with workers moving drugs or preparing for upcoming shipments. The total seizure across all 8 sites included 9,000 pounds of cocaine, 2,000 pounds of methamphetamine, and 800 pounds of fentanyl. The street value exceeded $300 million. 43 individuals were arrested at the various locations. The suspects included tunnel operators who managed movement through the passages, workers who transported drugs underground, warehouse managers who coordinated surface operations, and security personnel who protected the facilities. Most were Mexican nationals working in the U.S. on behalf of the trafficking organization. The tunnel exits were documented by forensic teams who photographed and measured the passages before they were destroyed. The engineering sophistication varied significantly between tunnels. The most advanced passage included reinforced walls, sophisticated ventilation, and drainage systems to prevent flooding. The crudest tunnel was barely large enough for a person to crawl through and showed evidence of recent partial collapses. Destruction of the tunnels required specialized expertise. Engineers assessed each passage to determine the safest method of making it permanently unusable. Some were filled with concrete pumped in from the surface. Others were collapsed using controlled explosives. The goal was to eliminate the infrastructure without causing surface damage that might affect nearby buildings or utilities. The Mexican government cooperated in destroying the tunnel portions on their side of the border. Coordination was essential because collapsing only the U.S. light sections would leave the Mexican portions intact and potentially usable for future reconstruction. Complete destruction required both countries to act simultaneously. The investigation revealed the organizational structure behind the tunnel network. A coordinator based in Culiacan, Mexico, managed the overall operation. Regional supervisors oversaw individual tunnels, ensuring they remained operational and secure. Local managers handled day-to-day operations at each site, coordinating drug movements and maintaining tunnel infrastructure. The financial investment in the tunnel network was substantial. Construction costs for the 8 tunnels totaled approximately $18 million. Operational expenses, including utilities, maintenance, and personnel compensation, added several $100,000 monthly. But the revenue generated by moving drugs through the tunnels justified these costs many times over. The organization had developed contingency plans for tunnel discovery. Backup routes existed through other smuggling methods, including vehicle concealment at official crossing points and wilderness areas used by human couriers. The tunnels were preferred because of their efficiency and low interdiction risk, but the organization could adapt if they were eliminated. The prosecution of arrested individuals proceeded through federal courts in California and Arizona. Defendants faced charges including conspiracy to import controlled substances, conspiracy to operate a tunnel, and money laundering. The tunnel operation charges carried enhanced penalties under federal law, recognizing the seriousness of constructing smuggling infrastructure. Several defendants cooperated with prosecutors, providing information about how the tunnel network was constructed and operated. Their testimony described the planning process, the recruitment of engineers and workers, and the security measures employed to protect the operations. The information helped build cases against higher-level organizers who weren't present at the tunnels during the raids. The sentencing phase demonstrated the severe consequences of tunnel operations. Workers caught transporting drugs through the passages received 8 to 12 years. Tunnel managers who coordinated operations received 15 to 20 years. The coordinator who oversaw the entire network received a 30-year sentence. The tunnel discoveries generated significant media attention and political discussion about border security. Critics argued the tunnels demonstrated that physical barriers alone couldn't prevent drug smuggling. Proponents of enhanced border infrastructure countered that deeper and more extensive barriers would make tunnel construction more difficult and expensive. The law enforcement response included enhanced tunnel detection efforts along the border. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were expanded to cover additional areas. Seismic monitoring was increased to identify underground construction activity earlier. Coordination with Mexican authorities was strengthened to identify tunnel origins before they were completed. The economic impact of eliminating the tunnel network affected drug availability in markets the passages had supplied. Cities in California, Nevada, and Arizona experienced temporary shortages of cocaine and fentanyl in the weeks following the raids. Prices increased as alternative supply routes proved less efficient than the tunnels had been. The disruption lasted approximately 2 months before trafficking organizations adapted. Some increased smuggling through official ports of entry using vehicle concealment. Others expanded operations through remote desert areas using human couriers. The total volume moved through these alternative methods eventually approached what the tunnels had provided, but at higher costs and greater risks. Intelligence reports indicated the Sinaloa cartel was already planning construction of new tunnels in different locations. The organization viewed tunnel infrastructure as essential to their operational strategy, despite the risks of detection and the costs of construction. The destroyed tunnels would be replaced eventually as the cartel invested in rebuilding their underground smuggling capacity. The investigation provided valuable intelligence about tunnel construction techniques and operational methods. This information was used to improve detection capabilities and train law enforcement personnel to recognize signs of tunnel activity. The goal was to identify future tunnel projects earlier in the construction process before they became operational. The environmental impact of the tunnels became apparent during the destruction process. Several passages had damaged underground water resources by altering natural drainage patterns. Chemical contamination from construction materials had leached into soil and groundwater in some areas. Remediation efforts were required to address the environmental damage caused by the illegal excavations. The properties used to conceal tunnel exits were seized through civil forfeiture as assets involved in drug trafficking. Some were eventually sold to legitimate buyers after the tunnels were destroyed and documented. Others remained in government custody for years because potential buyers were reluctant to purchase properties associated with cartel activities. The communities where the tunnels were discovered experienced complex reactions. Some residents expressed relief that trafficking infrastructure had been eliminated. Others worried about declining property values in neighborhoods associated with cartel operations. Local businesses expressed concern that media coverage would create lasting negative perceptions of their areas. The investigation demonstrated the extraordinary lengths trafficking organizations would pursue to move drugs into the United States. The engineering expertise, financial investment, and operational complexity required to build and operate the tunnel network reflected the enormous profits generated by drug trafficking. As long as those profits remained available, organizations would continue investing in sophisticated smuggling infrastructure. 3 years after the discoveries, all 8 tunnels had been destroyed and rendered permanently unusable. None had been reconstructed, though intelligence suggested the cartel had built new tunnels in different border locations. The cycle of construction, detection, and destruction continued as trafficking organizations and law enforcement engaged in ongoing competition. The tunnel network had represented a major trafficking capability that moved billions of dollars worth of drugs over its operational lifetime. Its destruction was a significant enforcement success that disrupted Sinaloa operations and generated valuable intelligence. But it didn't end drug trafficking through the border region. New methods emerged to replace the lost capacity as the fundamental economics driving the trade remained unchanged. The seismic sensors that had detected the original tunnel construction continued monitoring the border region. The data was analyzed regularly for signs of new underground activity that might indicate another tunnel network being built. The technology had proven its value in detecting infrastructure that remained invisible to surface surveillance. The lesson was clear. Trafficking organizations would invest whatever resources were necessary to move their products into profitable markets. Tunnels represented one method among many. When one avenue was blocked, alternatives emerged. The enforcement challenge was maintaining pressure across all smuggling methods simultaneously, while recognizing that complete elimination of trafficking infrastructure was impossible as long as demand persisted.